Hi guys, thanks for joining me again today. We're going to look at a different part of my collection today. This is going to be the Super Nintendo portion of it. I do collect for Super Nintendo, not as much as I do for NES. I do have a fair collection, some games that are worth, a fair amount, some that are more obscure. For the Super Nintendo, I really like to collect games that I actually really like to play. So most of the games that I really want, I have. I'm obviously missing a lot of obscure ones, but I hope to get some of those in the future. So to start off, we'll go through some of the games that I picked out. These are games obviously in my collection. They're not all of them, but they're ones that I either really like to play or just generally like having in the collection for one reason or another. So the first game is going to be Super Metroid. Okay, so obviously a lot of people's favorite Metroid game, a lot of people's favorite game on the Super Nintendo. This is one of my personal favorites for Metroid. I think this game improved upon the original in every way. It was huge for the time, very groundbreaking. I think it's just the perfect mix of platforming and puzzles and action and adventure. I definitely think that if you can get a hold of this copy, you should get it, because it's constantly going up in price just because the fact that it is such a good game. Everybody wants to have it. The next in my collection is Earthbound. So everybody knows about Earthbound, obviously one of the more expensive titles for the Super Nintendo, but also a great game for anybody who likes RPGs. Very different from traditional RPGs. Obviously, the setting is different. It's not you're not going into battle with like ogres or wizards or anything like a lot of traditional RPGs. Very different setting with aliens and kids, and it's very fun to play. This is obviously just the cartridge. If you have the big box with this game, it is well over $1,000 now. It just continues to go up in price. It's crazy. Next game is Chrono Trigger. So again, another RPG. The Super Nintendo was obviously known very well for its RPGs that it had at that time. Strong support from Square, obviously. Made some really good games, including Final Fantasy, Super Mario RPG. This one is considered by many the pinnacle of kind of what Square has done. Chrono Trigger, very well regarded. I'm not a huge RPG fan myself. I've played a bit of it. It is good. But for people who are really into those type of games, many will put this at the top of their list. So one that I just mentioned, another RPG, is Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars. This fused, obviously, Super Mario and his world with RPG elements, which eventually turned into Paper Mario later on in the console cycle. There are still some RPG type on the handhelds, but there hasn't really been anything like this since the Super Nintendo days. This is a very highly regarded game as well. Very fun, good comedy in it, good graphics for the time. Again, collectors generally want this in their collection one way or another. Moving on. Mega Man X. So this is the first one of the three that were on the Super Nintendo, Mega Man X2 and X3. As you move up from X1 to X2 to X3, they obviously go up in price. These are very sought after by collectors, but they're also great games. The X games were a nice break from the traditional Mega Man games. I love Mega Man X. I don't have the others in my collection yet. Maybe one day I will, if hopefully they come down in price, because they are very expensive right now. This is one I just added to my collection, and this is Super Bonk. Okay, so many remember Bonk's Adventure from the TurboGrafx 16. That was the first time I had ever played it. This basically follows along kind of the same premise. You're Bonk, you're going through side-scrolling levels using your head as a weapon. I've played a bit of it. It is pretty interesting. I don't think it quite held up to the standards of like Mario or other platforms at that time, but it is a good game, and it's getting harder to find as well. Next one is Run Saber. So this is an Atlas game. For those who know, Atlas is notorious for limiting the amount of copies that they actually produce of games. So again, this was a limited run game, and it is a very good game. It's very similar to Strider, if anybody has played that on the Sega Genesis, just by look and a lot of the gameplay itself. It is a fun game though, really well designed, good enemies, good control, and same thing, going up in price, especially because it is an Atlas game. Most of their games do end up being fairly pricey. Next one is one of my personal favorites on the Super Nintendo, and that is Blackthorn. Blackthorn, if you've never played it, is kind of a hidden gem. A lot of people know about it, but it's kind of more of a cult following for people. If you've never played it, it's similar in the style to Prince of Persia, which also came out on the Super Nintendo and for other systems. It's a side-scrolling kind of adventure game where you're running and jumping, hanging on cliffs, descending, kind of avoiding traps. But the difference between the two is Blackthorn, you're using guns, shotguns in this game to engage enemies and to progress. And there's also puzzles as well as the platforming elements. It's just a really good mix of everything. One of my personal favorite games. I got this a few years ago. I still play it. I've beaten it several times. If you've never played it, you should really give it a shot. One of the last ones is Pocky and Rocky. This game is kind of a, I guess I would qualify it as a shooter. It's not a side-scroller, it's a top-down. It's a really fun game, especially if you have two players. Fast-paced action. It's difficult. Definitely better with two players because it is hard. But it's a really well-made game. Tons of fun. I was lucky to get this. I bought a lot of Super Nintendo games with a system, and it was a fairly good price, and I didn't even know this was in here until I picked it up. And it was definitely a steal for what I got it for, because this game is very expensive now. The second one is even more expensive. You can find it. So one thing you're going to notice that I didn't put on my list is The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. I will put that in. I am a huge Zelda collector, a Zelda fan, my favorite series of all time, so that's why I didn't include it in this one. But it will be included in the other one because that is probably my favorite Super Nintendo game of all time. So now we'll move on to just some of the systems that I have. They're going to be very familiar to you. Over here is the Japanese Famicom, Super Famicom. Okay, so this was the Japanese version, obviously, of the Super Nintendo. Many people consider it the superior version, just from a design standpoint. I do really like the design of the Super Famicom, especially the controller down here. I like the different color buttons on the controller. I don't know what it is, but it just makes it stand out more. I really like this in my collection. And it can be easily modified if you want to play just North American Super Nintendo games on it. It's very easy to do. In the middle is the Super Nintendo, but that's the second generation one. It was a smaller, cheaper alternative to the original. If you pick it up, you can sure feel it because it's probably half the weight of the original one. It doesn't feel like there's much to it. They were sold at the end of the life cycle. A little bit harder to find than the original ones. But they definitely were better in the sense that they kept their color better than the originals did. It's tougher to find the original ones in good shape because of the yellowing that they all go through. I'm lucky. I have this console here. That's my Super Nintendo. It's in pristine shape. There's no yellowing at all, and this is the original version. So for anybody who's not sure, there was 2 revisions for the Super Nintendo. This one was the original one, which really suffered from bad yellowing over time. This one has no yellowing at all. It's absolutely perfect. The second revision, basically, in the first revision, when you put the cartridge in and you turn the power on, it engaged a lock so that you couldn't take out the cartridge. With the second revision, when you did that, it didn't lock it in anymore. There was a sticker that was underneath the power button that said, you know, turn off the console before you remove the cartridge. I think it was just a cost-saving measure to eliminate parts out of that. So carrying on, here in the front, that's obviously the Super Nintendo Mini that came out recently. I wanted to include it in this one because it is part of the Super Nintendo family. Also comes with Star Fox 2, which was never released on the Super Nintendo. Very cool console to have. It's nice to be able to play all the Super Nintendo games through HDMI. Going on, here in the middle, those are the acclaimed dual turbo wireless controllers. They work with this part here that's attached to that Super Nintendo. Back in the day, if you're not old enough to remember, they did not have wireless communication controllers like they do now that operated on frequency. Wireless controllers back then were infrared, so you basically had to be sitting right in front of the console. Even then, they still didn't work very well. But it's nice to have these. They're actually fairly pricey now to find these. These ones are pretty much immaculate condition. They still work. Not that I would ever use them, but it's an interesting piece to have. And that's essentially it for my Super Nintendo collection. Obviously, I have more games. If guys are still interested, I can show off more that I have. But I just wanted to give you a quick look at some of the things that I enjoy having in my collection. If you like this video, please hit like. If you have any comments, feel free to post them. And I will be back with another review. Thank you.